So just maybe you start with the acknowledgement here. Okay. You acknowledge that what we call Alberta is the traditional and ancestral territory of many peoples, presently subject to Treaty 6, 7, and 8, namely the Blackfoot Confederacy, Kainai, Piikani, Tsitsika, Cree, Dene, Saulteaux, Nakota Sioux, Stoney Nakoda, and the Tsuut'ina Nation, and the Métis people of Alberta. This includes the Métis settlements in the 6 regions of the Métis Nation of Alberta within the historical Northwest Métis. We acknowledge the many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit who have lived in and cared for these lands for generations. We are grateful for the traditional knowledge keepers and elders who are still with us today, and those who have gone before us. We make this acknowledgement as an act of reconciliation and gratitude to those whose territory we reside on or are visiting. Before our talk tonight, I just wanted to do a couple of announcements. So, as many are aware, the in-person sit starts on Saturday. So a couple tickets sold in Edmonton and a couple in Lethbridge. Actually, there's actually been quite a bit of interest in Lethbridge. So we'll see what that yields. Kathy will be there on Saturday morning with they're all set up and ready for the Zoom. So anyway, yeah, so we'll all connect on Saturday either via Zoom or in person, however, and yeah, that'll be good. So I should the survey. I just finished compiling the raw data yesterday, so I'll put it all up for everybody as well. Some interesting stuff in there, actually. Some good suggestions and some interesting things. I'm just trying to think next week. We'll have to talk about next week. I don't know if anybody has any suggestions. It's supposed to be our first study session based on the schedule. Yeah, so we'll have to talk about that. I will not be with you, unfortunately. So I think Gyokei was gonna host or co-host, or somebody can co-host or host. We'll figure that out later. Anyway, yeah. So, and then yeah, I think that's it. I don't know if anybody else has anything to add. Gyokei, I don't know if you have any other announcements.
Let's see. Well, I have something I can share later. It's
Okay.
it's nothing official.
And Shotsuki is when again?
Oh, that's right. Yes, thank you. The Sozenji Buddhist temple will have Ohigan service, which is a Japanese Buddhist tradition where we commemorate our ancestors on the equinox. It's usually typically we do this in the middle of March, middle of September, and we have So there's a service, and if you could join us, we'll do this in hybrid style, partially in person, partially on Zoom, and so we're trying to get back to gradually do in-person service as well.
Great, thank you. Well, so without further ado, unless anybody else has anything to add, so as promised, Gyokei has agreed to give a Dharma talk tonight. So thanks very much. And
thank you for the opportunity. Yeah.
So I'll just turn it over to you. Thanks.
Okay. Well, thank you. Well, unlike any other previous talks that I shared, this is about Dogen Zenji. So, it's mostly informative, but also I'd like to sort of add some, I guess, a perspective as well, especially when we talk about somebody like Dogen. We tend to cut the person out of the context. And the more we think of the person, like Shakyamuni Buddha or Dogen, it's important to think of the social historical context, because usually, almost always, these people they emerged in relation to usually other leaders, other factors, co-origination. And before I say too much, I'd like to share the picture of Dogen Zenji. And the script that I have is on Japanese. I didn't translate it, so but there are few other few different versions of the pictures. So that's one, and I'll just switch to the script. Let's see. So when Dogen Zenji, Dogen, started become more eminent, getting to be known when he made his aspiration to pursue the Buddhist practice. That was around the time about 1,000 years have passed since the Shakyamuni Buddha's passing. And oh, sorry, the Shakyamuni Buddha's passing, and then then even after it reached to China, it came through the Korean Peninsula, and so we did have Buddhism for quite a long time. But just like how it often happens to be, that was sort of the teachings, as you probably know, because all the scriptures are translated into English by the academics and experts. It was limited to availability was limited to those who have literacy, academically advanced, or maybe it was sometimes used for political motives and things. But that was around the time it became more available to common people, commoners. And this happened in relation to all the natural disasters, the calamities, epidemics, and warfare, civil wars. So it was a pretty rough time when all this society, this society in general was quite a bit in turmoil. And such was the social background. Dogen Zenji was said to be born in January 2nd of year 1200 in a place called I'll just say this in Japanese. Yamashiro no kuni otokuni Kugamura. Kugamura means Kuga village. And it's today, a present day, a part of Kyoto. It's called Fushimi Ward in Kyoto. So, Kyoto nowadays it's big, but it was a little bit off the center. I think it's the northeast part of the Kyoto. And he passed away on September 22nd, 1253, at age 53. So he died at, considering the lifespan back then, he still died a bit young. Many people wonder still today how Dogen's teaching might have evolved or how his expression might have changed if he aged a bit more. But that's just a what if, big if. And of course, he's known to be the founder of Soto Zen school, and he's known that he traveled to China, Song Dynasty at the time, to deepen his practice. And he's known also to have brought the philosophy, the practice of Zen. And I'm just going to go through quickly, the overall sort of, the flow, just sort of how it happened. So Dogen's spiritual background, he practiced first in the most eminent, obvious choice for everyone who wanted to practice Buddhism. So Tendai school. There's a big, kind of like university today, which everybody goes. Then from there, he went on trying to deepen his practice and understanding. He went on to China. And then he encountered Zen, Soto Zen in China. And he had a fortune to meet some great monks, and then eventually his own teacher, Lujin Tendo Nyojo Zenji. Then he came back to Kyoto, where he was, and started to share his practice, his teaching. And as it gained popularity, it was sort of condemned by the existing organization of Tendai. And he was sort of subject to a little, I think it was marked as a little, he experienced some oppression or pressure. So he moved on to the where the age is located right now. And that's when there was a big donor. It's kind of like how Shinji Suzuki Roshi found this person who donated this place of green gulch farm. There was a samurai shogun, a local warlord, who donated him land. He was a big sponsor and supporter. And his contribution, of course, from our perspective, in Japanese Sotoshu, so we call this shikantaza, or simply translated as just sitting, which I'll talk a little bit in detail later. But also, just as much as Rinzai Zen has contributed to this, a lot of customs we have in Japan, we kind of don't even think about it anymore. Is based on the influence that came with Zen. So that's an overall thing. 1200s, he was born to the high-ranking family in Kyoto. 3 years later, he lost his dad, and at age 8, was just 1208. He also lost his mother, and then he became fostered, adopted, and grew up with his foster father, whose name was Fujiwara Motofusa, who was also one of the big guys around that time politically. And so then, as I said, at age 14, so he was about to be a teenager, he went on to the Mount Hiei and had the first novice ordination as under the Tendai's as Koen, which was he was the monk, a teacher, the leader of the Tendai school. And at age 15, so that age, in his teenage, he left the Hiei, Mount Hiei. And some of you already know the reason he left. And then he asks for some advice. He still continued to learn from another Tendai teacher, Koin of Onjoji Temple. And with Koin's advice, he, at age 17, again, he is a teenager, and 12, 17, he got to visit a Kenninji temple where the Eisai who brought Rinzai started. At the age when Dogen was 15, Eisai had already passed away. So he never got to meet Eisai, but he got to meet one of the best students of Eisai, Myozen. Then this fateful day, year 1223, at age 24. So you can see from age 17 to age 24, he spent quite a bit of time with Myozen. Myozen and Dogen both share this aspiration to go to Song Dynasty, to China, which was a big, big thing. I think it's a lot bigger than again going to Japan or us. It's logistically, but also the distance was just unbelievably far. In 1225, again, I'm just still in the part of our overall view of his life. Dogen was at 25, as a young man still. He had a fortune to meet Dogen Zenji at Tendozan. The temple name was Keitokuji Temple. Then what we hear is that he had attained some sort of deep understanding. Then he received Inca from Dogen Zenji. We hear Dogen Zenji and Dogen were very, very close. And as somebody who studied language, I often wonder how fluent Dogen was in Chinese at the time, and must have been really rare to find some Japanese monk who spoke Chinese fluently at the time. Anyway, so then at age 27, that was 1227, he left China and came back to Japan and started to share the Zen. Then the first thing he wrote, as you know, is the Fukanza Zengi, Universal Recommendation of Zazen. And at age 33, he built a Koshoji temple and in sort of around the class, like a middle class, high middle class of samurai class, that sort of became popular. He also started writing Shobo Genzo, which he didn't get to finish, but his students completed. Then at age 43, with all the oppressions or the pressure from the existing organization, existing schools, um, it was there was a time when they made the decision it would be better to move on to a place called Echizen, a very mountainous region. That's where AH is standing right now. And those who helped him tremendously was Hatano Yoshishige, one of the warlords. And then he built a temple called Daibutsuji, which was later the name changed later into Eiheiji. One interesting thing, at age 48, he was invited to the Kamakura, which is another emerging capital of the samurai, the warlords. And he made an attempt, well, some say, to spread Zen in Kyoto. I mean, what is today Tokyo, sorry. And it didn't quite go well. I think that was in the context of all the rivalries of politics. And then he was invited. And then I think I'm not sure he went there. Some say he thought it was important to maintain some sort of balance. And also partially because Hatano Yoshige, the person who's been supporting him tremendously to save his face, to sort of support him as well, he agreed to go to the capital. Nyojo Zenji's advice was to stay away from this, to do this practice, in the deep mountain. So what I hear is that he came back from this samurai's capital with some regret for leaving Eiheiji. But that's one story. And then, as I said, Dogen died at age 53, and he left his student, Kon Ejo. As if you go through the names, that would be the next name. He handed over the position to him. Then he went back to Kyoto to get a better medical treatment, medical attention, and that's where he passed away. Right. So, as I said, this is a little bit of a repetition, but it's going to be a little bit more detail. That was year 1200s exactly, the beginning of 1200s. He was born in Kyoto. His father's name, one theory, although there are many theories there, says was Kogami Chichika, was one of the ministers in the government. And then his father was someone called Ishi. And as I said, both his father and mother passed away when he was still very small. So we always see this story as the time when he sort of how just like Shakyamuni Buddha grew up without his actual biological mother, he experienced this, and this little boy must have sensed something since he was extremely intelligent. And this is another thing that we hear. Again, this is not 100%, but that's the most prominent theory that we have. Right. So that's how he encountered the impermanence at age 3 and age 8. And as I said, he was really intelligent. And then there are several stories, just as many individuals like him have stories later. But one of them was that he was reading Abhidharma, one of the books from India, at age 9, and something a grown-up would take. It would take 8 years for a grown-up to really understand, along with many Chinese books. The fact that he was fluent in Chinese, this kind of makes sense. And it also hurts me personally that how intelligent he was. He probably understood quite well the circumstance of losing his parents. And after he was adopted, he, this foster father, was from also the high-ranking family. I expected him to be a great politician, minister and a politician. Kind of like how King Shuddharana, Shakyamuni Buddha's father, was hoping that the Gautama Siddhartha would become a great king. So I kind of love the similarity of the stories, how similar his early days. There was a whole expectation, but he was quite determined, or we hear that to renounce, to be ordained as a monk. April 9th of 1213. So he was 13 and he was turning 14. He went to Mount Hiei, which was the most typical place, well known, because he was in Kyoto. And he did the most, I guess, orthodox way of novice ordination, which just like anybody else at the time. And he was one of, I suppose, just like I think American students go to Japan, go to China, go to different countries. It was quite aspirational. And he spent some time, but he saw some things that he didn't expect. Or I think one of the things is that, well, there are monks who are trying to get qualifications, or there are even those who were just not that interested in this kind of pursuit. But in the meantime, he was a very kind of study-oriented person. So, and as you know, so he did. I think it's the same thing happened in Chinese library too. He had access. He read quite a few books. One question that affects our practice itself that we do today is this principle that the part that he saw called Honrai Hon Wo Shou Tennenji Shoshin. It's in Japanese. This was a teaching of Tendai school, which triggered his question, and that was the first kind of encounter with question when, as a teenager, he faced, which was we all humans have Buddha nature, and we are Buddhas as we are. Then, Dogen started to question them. If we are originally the Buddhas, then what's the use of this practice? Why do we do this in the first place? And I suppose with his curiosity, he kept asking this kind of questions, which around him, nobody really gave him satisfactory answers. To this question, if we are Buddhas as humans, being humans, then why are these ancestral teachers made such enormous effort to practice? If I say this, the bottom line right here, the question he was looking for, the way we understand today is because we are Buddhas, we practice. Because we are Buddhas, we practice, we live life as it is. So it can sound a little confusing, but that's often seen as this life that we receive as a human being. So there's a whole shift of perspective here. But of course, he was looking for the answer to this question. He left Mount Hiei, as I said, then moved on to another teacher of Tendai school, Koin Ajari, who was another big figure in Tendai school of Anjoji Temple in Shiga, the next prefecture. And I'm surprised how Koin was a bit open-minded. I think this teacher, Koin, sincerely took his question. And it was the one who suggested, like, if you're that keen on finding this out, like, would you be interested in going all the way to China? So, and he also, in that context of conversation, he mentioned the presence of this new teacher who just came back, bringing Zen, Rinzai Zen. to Japan, and the teacher's name, as you all know, was Eisai Zenji. Eisai Zenji, as I said, had passed away before Dogen went to visit temple of Kenninji, but he was fortunate to meet Myozen, who shared the same aspiration. So to these two young priests, Myozen was older, of course, had this vision. We want to go to China and really study. Myozen was one of the best students, and he right, sorry. And then, like I said, it was another person who had this dream to make it to China, and they shared this vision together. Dogen and Myozen traveled. It was a risky trip at the time because of all the typhoons. If you know the climate in Japan, there's always typhoon coming from on Philippine Peninsula, and so it always involved risk. But they made it to China, Song Dynasty, at age 24. But when Dogen arrived in China, Myozen and he sort of each took their own routes. They kind of separated and then went on. Although when he came back from China, he had ash of Myozen, who passed away in the land of China. It was they are sort of it was a life. You know, they were giving the whole life to this practice. What I hear after age 24, I mean, he went to China, then he traveled around looking for the teachers. He went to a Keitokuji of Tendos, and that was actually where he met Nyojo Zenji, Rujin. But when he went there, Nyojo Zenji was not there yet. So he went there, and then he went on to Hoon Koji Temple, another temple of Tendai school. Oh, sorry, Tendai-san. Sorry, it's not Tendai school. And then another temple called Juganji. So he was traveling all around. And I want to kind of share one thing because I've been doing this without sharing this. Here you go. So there are a couple of episodes about the old monks. That was before, I mean, I think it was me. Oh, yeah, in the context of while he was traveling in China. The encounter with the monk who was drying the shiitake mushroom. Here you go. This is the one. This is the one kind of model that we have in Japan. So I wish I could see the script at the same time, but sorry. You know, it's kind of like janitors in United States and Canada because I felt the same way when I came to Canada as an exchange student. That how they're seen as somehow a bit of a less of an occupation. It was like that the servants, the food was seen such. But then something revolutionary happened, which was the encounter with these monks. And Dogen, who is very intelligent, aspirational student, naturally asked, like, why are you trying the mushroom, shiitake mushroom, in this super hot weather? Um, it was really hot. Then there was this old monk, as you saw in the statue, with this cane and covered in sweat. Uh, and then for Dogen, it didn't make sense to him. And so first Dogen asked, "How old are you, master?" And the old monk said, I'm 68." And you look like a very high-ranking priest. Then what's with this drying the mushroom, like shiitake mushroom out here in this, with no shade, in the shade. And Dogen couldn't help but ask, like, why aren't your students doing this? Then the monk's reply was, if we have the students do this, and then it is not my practice anymore. Then why don't you do it when it's not that hot, when it's more moderate? Then the reply from the monk, as you probably might know, is like, if you do not do this now, when else do we do this? So that was one shocking culture shock, Dogen. encounters. Because, at the time, Japan always saw Buddhism as something for this, like, academically advanced, like some selected people. So that was probably wasn't something Dogen had on his mind. And then this is something actually some American people study and read this text over and over, but don't quite get this until you go to Japan and actually share this as an actual experience. So, and then the same with us. We start from the college and university, and I went to Catholic school. So going there to actually see that this is a real thing, it's a culture shock. Even though we read this, we understand this, to actually attain this with their body is a whole different thing. Anyway, um, and there's another big episode about the Dogen's encounter with another Tenzo monk. The encounter with him, coming all the way from like many kilometers, tens of kilometers, try just to buy a mushroom from Japan, I think. And then Dogen was waiting for the permit, the visa, I guess, to come through. And then he saw this monk looking for this mushroom for the monastery. And he was very excited to see the first Chinese monk. And then he wanted to have a conversation with him, invited him to his room, but this old monk declined his offer because he had to go back to the monastery to prepare the meal. Then at the time, Dogen asked, like, the preparation meals can be something your servants, young monks can take care of. Um, like, isn't the Dharma talk more important than the preps for the meal? That was a natural question from Dogen. But this old monk kind of laughed hard and said, "Well, you young man, you don't really get what the practice is, do you?" And it kind of left him, and he went back to the monastery. So these kind of two events led him to write a book, Tenzo Kyokun, Instruction to Tenzo. Dogen couldn't quite understand this first. And this is so relevant to us because we are that Dogen right now and continue to be that. I still feel that way in many, many, many occasions. Dogen wanted, but that was an inspirational experience. He went on traveling, and then he went to Keitokuji Temple, but he didn't have this fateful encounter with Nyojo Zenji at the time because he wasn't there, so he left. But then, after he traveled around China, he heard that there was this monk who came, who's as a to lead the Keitokuji Temple, and there was a remark that he's an amazing teacher. So he went there, and this is the most mysterious part. I will end my talk today that Nyojo Zenji made Dogen he actually wanted Dogen to be his jisha, someone who holds incense right there. And then at the time, like attendant. So that's the part like we still feel astounded. There he was surrounded by all the Chinese monks, students, and teachers. But Nyojo Zenji wanted Dogen to take this role, and which Dogen declined out of respect to all the monks, but also he didn't want any cause trouble because he was an foreigner at the time. But this kind of episode shows how intuitively I think they were very close to each other and then shared a lot of time together, exchanging, the insight day and night. And in 1225, we hear he had this experience of dropping away body and mind, Shinjin Datsurak, the experience awakening. And then after he practiced a bit more, he went back to Japan, as was suggested by Nyojo Zenji himself. When he came back to Japan, he carried along the ash of Myozen, who came along with him to China. So that's how it was. I can talk a little bit more details about the experience he had with Nyojo Zenji, but I'll finish my talk here. So that's the story, and there's a lot more in his life that shows his uh, face as a spiritual leader, but also his face as a person in many different ways. Anyway, I'll stop it here just in case you have questions. Thank you. You know, sharing this, I often wonder his text stories is are more translated into English language. So I can't help but wonder, like, isn't this all out there? As like, I mean, Wikipedia had some information, but I'm curious, like, is this all too ordinary? Like, you know Dogen all too well, or what? I mean, also, what's your impression of him? I'd be curious to hear.
Gyokei, thank you so much for that talk.
Yeah.
I have heard the story of Shakyamuni Buddha over and over and over again, but this is the first time I've really heard the full story of Dogen. So that was wonderful. And it's also helpful in the fact that my Sangha is getting ready to start studying Shobogenzo. And so that was very helpful to me, giving me a little more insight into the man himself. So I really appreciated learning the history of Dogen. So thank you so
Oh,
much.
thank you, Jenna. Oh. What about you, Nathan?
Sorry, I was muted there. Um, Actually, the information that you brought up for Dogen, I happened to come across in a podcast this past week. So it's quite interesting to hear it again, to know that there is this much detail that is really talked about for him.
Hmm. Yeah, thank you. Well, about you, Marlene, Joe.
No, this was all entirely new information for me
Okay.
and for Joe. So this is an excellent introduction. I guess, Gyokei, what was you talked a little bit about the historical context. Like, what was help me understand what the religious scene in Japan was like in 1200. Like, 'cause Soto Zen is not the first Zen school he established,
No.
right? So was the what was the
Dude,
religious text at the time?
there were two major schools, Tendai School, the big university, the temple, Dogen went, and the Shingon School. That was happening in the capital, But then in a local level, this is my own home temple too. Before Soto Zen started to stream through the islands, we had hundreds of years. So, 600, 700s, around that time, esoteric Buddhist practice, mountain monks, quite big. That's the kind of cultural setting I grew up, and then that was also big. And then it kind of dwindled along with the local traditions and cultures. Um, one of the reasons I think it's interesting too, because I know somebody who studied Dogen extensively, including his personal, like his things. It's just not just as that sacred face that he has. Says he understands, and I don't know as much as this professor does, but one thing we sense as a Sotoshu monk, I mean, as just out of this formal we're supposed to say kind of respect. I always sensed Dogen's affinity to Shakyamuni Buddha himself, not just because of his personal background, but he really, we can sense how, I think he would have traveled all the way to, where Shakyamuni Buddha was, if he had a choice. I often feel that way. But that wasn't, and so in a sense, he didn't call this Zen, of course, just like Shakyamuni Buddha didn't call this Buddhism. That's a common thing for all these people. We don't label this. It was what Shakyamuni Buddha did, and he wanted to people know what it was. And then, of course, by then, just like as we call this school Soto Zen or Zen, we label things, it comes along with this kind of understanding of organization. So when somebody comes, this is it, and we don't have a name for it, but this is what you have to understand, and an established organization will have to react. So we all know that he went through quite a bit tough time at the time. Now we have a respectful relationship as somebody who trained, but yeah, the wars we hear, and I think it was relevant in Soto Zen too, wars. It's a tricky term to use. But just like Shakyamuni Buddha experienced all of those Hindu teachers, who does things, rituals, but it's not quite relevant to the life. There's a little detachment from these people who are suffering at the time. Not just Dogen, Shinran, all the school founders, they were all around that same era, responding to the needs of the world and society, trying to figure out the way to make it work for people who are suffering. Then those who try to make that effort will encounter experience this counter reaction. Sorry, I kind of lost in the stream of thought. What was I going to say? Anyway, so there was a lot of formality. Oh, there's a lot of I don't know. I don't like to use the word of hypocrisy, but it's corruption, deterioration of spiritual cultures, for young teenage Dogen to question, which actually is a typical thing all of us go through in some ways, whether you in the religious context or not. Anyway, so but that there was the, I think, collective aspiration from all these different teachers who embodied it differently, and Dogen's way was to find out the source, and then I think he was really fortunate to meet Nyojo Zenji. There's a rest of the story which I didn't get to share today, which was after Dogen's passing. Dogen still, I think, had to figure out. He had lots of supporters, students. He made an effort to disseminate. He shared this with people. But at one point, he makes a shift. Then he, the famous word is he tried to raise half of one student, at least. So his focus was more like, how can I leave at least one student who understands this? So this sort of a singular line of sense. And then I also think that's also might be something to do he might have experienced in what is in today's Tokyo, samurai warlord's capital at the time. Who he went there, he made an effort to let people understand this, but I think it was all this political turbulence, turmoil. It wasn't that easy. Dogen also, I think, still had struggled trying to figure out. And so we're very curious how he might have matured into sort of monk if he had lived over the age of 53. The Fukanza Zengi, the teaching he wrote, and Shobo Genzo as well, was all the things he wrote before he reached 53, right? And partially it was incomplete, so his students edited it. After he died, his successor, Kon Ejo, who came from a whole different school initially, Dharma school. You can imagine we have a Soto Zen school, but then there's a whole Rinzai school who fell in love with Dogen's teaching, and the whole thing came over to join him. Shakyamuni Buddha himself experienced this. The teacher of a whole different school joined, and that's how the Sangha grew tremendously. Koun Ejo comes from that different Dharma school, but then because of his personality, his quality, amazing teacher he became a success. But then third generation came. Simply put, one was a revolutionist who tried to fit this in to make it more make sense for the parishioners at the time who were supporting AH working. And there were other students of Koun Ejo who wanted to keep this way of Dogen. This is it, nothing else way. So you can say conservatist and liberal, and then it's kind of split. And many who didn't agree with this sort of paving the path. So the third generation, I think, had to resign at one point. Ejo had to come back after retirement, and somehow, after he passed away, the third generation Gyokei came back, but then many didn't agree. So AH kind of almost went to it disappeared. Supporter of Atano Yoshige, and Gyokei didn't quite, Gyokei couldn't get the same level of support from Hatano Yoshige. And that's why it almost kind of went into extinction. We all know this. And in a sense, it's got to make sense for American teachers and sanghas that we want the purest form. We want that spotless way of practice. Then somehow things are kind of dwindling down. Like, why is it not working? What's something's wrong? What if we figure out? And then, it's interesting to know that this third generation crisis happened at Eiheiji. And that's where Dogen Zenji came, the fourth generation. And it was his contribution, the way he embodied the Dharma, that made Soto Zen spread across the country. And I think in today's US and in Canada, Keizan Zenji is not quite as well recognized. He is depicted as the mother of Soto Zen school. And again, I'm not saying, which is wrong, which is right, because that discussion itself defeats the quality of practice, the nature of Soto Zen practice. But as a historical fact, it happened. And so Soto Zen continued to evolve, adapting the style of Shingon school, local, indigenous or local thing. It continued to evolve in very creative ways. And that's what makes the Soto Zen school in Japan today one big organization. So, yeah, interesting how things are going to evolve the next 100 years in North America. We are.
I think you should come back and give us a full-on part 2 with all the lovely details. I know you kind of just skimmed over things here for the moment, but I would love to have another detailed talk about, the fall of Eiheiji and Kazan coming here. I would love to hear that. So if you would consider coming for part 2, I would certainly like that.
It's like a Star Wars. There's an episode 2.
So speaking of Star Wars, Gyokei, so there's the movie. I don't know. Have you seen the movie? The Dogen movie? I've only made it about 2/3 of the way through, but I was curious as to what you thought about it. Yeah.
This is my observation. When the lay directors of this TV series or movie directors trying to depict Zen monk, they want to make it miraculous. The very nature of Soto Zen, there's no such thing as that miracle. So the moment we attain that enlightenment, I think there was some disagreement by heart, but then the director didn't compromise. So it had to be what it was. So
the scene where he receives transmission, right? And it's like a bad Star Trek episode where like there's like this transposition of Dogen and Enjo and Yojo. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know what exactly happened at the time, but uh,
Well, one thing I did want to ask, because it's it's a theme in the movie, and I was curious how true it was, and given that Dogen had gone to so many different places, he'd gone to different temples in Japan and in China.
right.
One of the things the movie really highlights or argues for is that sort of the notion that Buddhism had really been corrupted.
Mm,
And so he's going around looking for, sort of that root practice. And I don't know what is the historical perspective say about that? Is that a little bit overblown and just for dramatic effect, or is there something to that?
I know we hear all kinds of things. They kind of experienced a little bit of that. Yeah, when we're teenagers, I think we see that. Especially at that time, there's a period of time was obviously corrupt. There's, political connections. They're kind of bringing women in. It's depicted in the pictures, and I guess just a total loss of interest. And I think that's how the Dharma was. It was the period of the end of the Dharma. That was a little prediction from Shakyamuni Buddha's days. And it's interesting, like really, how these really outspoken leaders emerged. And they were all either prosecuted or not prosecuted, but it's not like prosecuted the way Jesus Christ was, but then they kind of sent away Dogen too. They were kind of fighting for that resurrection or that revitalization thing. And yeah, I think that's our general understanding. But as we get mature, as we get older and we understand how the temple structure worked, how the shogunate government supported temple, it's easy to label it as a hypocrisy and deterioration of spiritual culture and practice. And there are those streams who always makes this alive, like Kodo Sawaki's lineage, right? This lineage. But then it's, to me, again, this is just a little thing. There's a teaching like Sandokai. So how do we serve the country? How do we work within the context of social structure of this very human nature and then still practice this? And I myself today work for the Soto Zen organization as one of the officials. And some people say, hey, that's not it. And I can totally understand the sentiment of these people. But I'm not defending my position or anything or understanding, but it is an interesting thing to go out there now hoping that I can work with Rocky Mountain Zen, work with the Canadian value, local people, then work with the Tokyo headquarters, work with this institution. How do we do this without that? So I can kind of relate to these Chinese teachers at the time in Song Dynasty, those people who worked in the capitals, and also people like Dogen trying to figure this out. I think, the fact that he went to see the shogun at the time, there are things, which start to kind of make sense. But what we read through his writing was that young Dogen, who just came right back from China with that full aspiration, and this is it. So very interesting to see that core genuine spirits directly transmitted to North America. I always say this without hesitancy. North America, it's a Dogenism, and people stick to Dogen, and people are simply sometimes dismissed the whole thing that formed. And I feel some danger to it, although I see the greatest potential and sincerity at the same time. So again, we don't want to get stuck with this is right, this is wrong. But I think it's also good for Canadian community to understand that, how Dogen came to be who he was, and how his students came to be who they were, and why it had to grow that way, and how that thrived with that little more, how should I say? um, um, mature views. I don't know, mature views. I don't know. Maybe it's not a right word. A little cool-headedness. So that's the attempt I'd like to make with Rocky Mountains, and specifically, if that's okay. Yeah. Sorry, I'm gonna stop it here.
Thank you very much. Yeah. Anybody else have? Yeah. No? Okay. Well, thank you, Gyokei. Thank you very much for your talk, and we look forward to part 2.